and all the buffalo just turned around and came hardtailing it back. And there I was standing behind this buffalo herd, and this whole herd came running straight towards me.
Oh.
So luckily I found a tree that I was a little bit, not quite as wide as my shoulders, and I put my back against the tree with my 505 at the ready, and I had buffalo running past me. It's in spitting distance. I reckon if I could have stepped out, and I could have kicked one of those buffalo that ran past. But they didn't see me. They were running away.
Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here. Welcome to episode 206 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Like I mentioned last episode, Kevin Robertson is back again today as part of my latest mini-series on hunting in Africa. And specifically in this episode, we're talking about some quote-unquote classic Africa hunting cartridges. We cover the pros, cons, and recommended uses for almost everything from the 243 Winchester all the way up to the 600 and 700 Nitro Express for hunting in Africa in this episode. Among other things, we talk about how hunting in Africa is different from hunting in North America, the unique characteristics of some of the most popular species of game in Africa, and how those things dictate ideal ballistic performance. As you'll learn here shortly, there are some major differences between a typical deer or elk hunt in North America versus a plains game hunt in Africa, and something that works well for one might not necessarily be the best choice for the other. And you'll see what I mean here in a few minutes. Before we get started, I have a couple things I need your help with. First, sign up for my email list at huntingguns101.com. You'll get my free ebook when you do that, and you'll get my email updates I send out every weekday. If you like the podcast, you will love those emails. Among other things, I send an in-stock ammo email update every Friday to everyone on the list with some of the latest news on hunting ammo that I have found that's in stock and where you can get it. And I get feedback all the time from people who get these emails telling me how much they enjoy them. So make sure you are signed up to get those if you haven't already done so. That's huntingguns101.com. Next, you need to pick up copies of Kevin's books. The Perfect Shot was a revolutionary book when Kevin first published it back in the late 1990s, and it is still an incredibly useful resource, especially the updated edition currently in print, The Perfect Shot 2. If you have an upcoming hunt in Africa, or if you're just dreaming about hunting Africa one day, you need to buy this book and carefully study what he has to say. The information inside it is invaluable, and it reflects his decades of hard-earned experience as a professional hunter in Africa. Plus, that book is just really interesting and entertaining as well, and you'll learn all about hunting the most popular species of game in Africa, like buffalo, leopard, lion, elephant, hippo, croc, and all the really popular species of plains game, like kudu, impala, wildebeest, etc. Go to thebiggamehuntingblog.com/Kevin, and you can pick up a copy there that supports the Big Game Hunting Podcast and Kevin in the process. Okay, now let's talk about some of the more classic and popular Africa hunting cartridges. Okay, well, Kevin, once again, great to have you back on the show. Today, we're going to talk about classic Africa hunting cartridges. So can you start us off with maybe a story of someone using one of the lesser well-known cartridges and how it worked?
Yeah, good evening, John. Yes, I certainly can. Got some interesting stories, but let me just kick off with something that your readers or your listeners might find interesting. So when I was a farmer and a veterinarian in Zimbabwe, one day a little old lady came to my surgery. Her husband had recently died, and she was cleaning out all these things, and she found 5 boxes of unopened Kynoch 416 Rigby ammunition. You know, that distinctive red and yellow boxes, probably made in the early 1960s, and she just gave them to me. She said, listen, she didn't know what to do with them, and so she just gave them to me. And my learner PH at the time, I had an apprentice that was my apprentice, and he had a 416 Rigby. He had a Ruger M77 Mark II. So we went and shot all 50 of these cartridges off. We didn't realize it was prime collected stuff, and I had a chronograph in those days, and I chronographed it just out of matter of interest. And we had some rather classic hang fires, but we managed to chronograph about 10 of those cartridges. And what surprised me, so this is the 410 grains. When the 416 Rigby came out, it came out with a 410 grain bullet. And that bullet had a sectional density of 0.338, and I've mentioned that a few times before. But what actually surprised me that of the 10 cartridges that we chronographed, everyone was doing 2,150 feet per second. It was amazingly consistent. You know, the velocities would be 2,147, the next one would be 2,152, but a very small spread of velocity variation in those 10. And if you look at the literature of the 416 Rigby back in those days, it was a 410 grain bullet doing 2,370 feet per second or 5,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. And that was on the box, and because nobody had chronographs in those days, everybody took it as gospel truth. That's what the Brits were saying on their ammunition boxes. But if the truth be told, and the 416 Rigby developed a stellar African reputation. I mean, you never heard a bad word spoken about it anywhere or ever. I've never heard a bad word written about the 416 Rigby. Granted, Rigby only made, I think it was 183 or 176 416 Rigby rifles before the things went sideways and they went to California. But if the truth be told, the 416 Rigby's reputation was developed on 4,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy and not 5,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. So you might find that interesting. I certainly did.
That is interesting how it works, like you said, too. And it's also interesting how you find that magical 21 to 2,200 foot per second velocity range is so effective in so many of these different cartridges, too.
Yes, when you put it with a good high sectional density bullet. So I also told you that when I got my 505 Gibbs, I came with 300 original Gibbs cartridges made in 1936. And the literature on that said it was a 525 grain bullet, and it should have been doing 2,300 feet per second. That's what the literature said. And I chronographed about a dozen of those, and every one of those was doing 2,150 feet per second as well. I also mentioned that I had that 500 Nitro Express of my friend, and we went elephant hunting, and I chronographed some of that ammunition, and that was a 570 grain bullet meant to be doing 2,150 feet per second, and that was only doing 2,000 feet per second. And I also had a friend in Zimbabwe, had a Charles Lancaster 470, and he told me that every kind of ammunition bullet that he chronographed through his 470 was doing 150 feet per second slower than it was supposed to. So those figures were way out, but nobody knew, nobody tested it. Everybody just took it for gospel, and it worked. And it worked because probably the slower impact velocity meant the bullets expanded a bit slower, they probably held together, and certainly the recoil was probably less, which I believe would made a huge difference to individual shooting performance. Because if you compare the recoil of a 416 bullet doing 2,370 feet per second or 2,150 feet per second, there's a substantial decrease in recoil by almost about 30% or so, which makes those rifles much more suitable. So when we talk about the ballistics of all these cartridges, let's bear in mind that there is a sweet spot when it comes to African ballistics. And I believe it's that 2,150 feet per second with a bullet with a high sectional density, 0.33 something sectional density. That's when you get those really good ballistic performance with not too much excessive recoil and not too much muzzle blast, and that just makes shot placement better, and then everything sort of falls into place after that.
Yes, definitely. And before we move on from the velocity thing, it is amazing that last, say, 10% of velocity, that last, 100 or 200 feet per second or whatever there, in order to get that, you need, more powder than you would to get that, that first big chunk of the velocity there. So operating on the margins of it, pushing it more and more, you need more and more, and so that translates to more powder. And then that higher velocity combined with the additional powder gives you even more and more recoil and all of that stuff. And I kind of wonder if I'm sure we'll discuss this later, say like with the 4.58 Winchester Magnum, about how if maybe they would have had a little bit lower standards there at the beginning, they would have maybe avoided some of the problems they had at the beginning.
Oh, yes, I agree. But to go back to your original question, so remember I told you about I did that hunt when I was still a learner professional hunter with the guy with the camouflage boots, and he didn't wear any socks, and he got his feet all blistered up. You remember
yes.
that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he was shooting a .416 Weatherby Magnum, and I also mentioned how terrible I thought that rifle was. But his buddy that came with him was also from California, and he had a 375, and I've been racking my brains all day to think whether it was either 375 Weatherby or a 375 JRS. But he was shooting nozzle partitions, 300 grain nozzle partitions, and he was very proud of the fact that the muzzle velocity was 2,650 feet per second. So it was a 2-on-1 hunt. Basically, it means there were two professional hunters, and it was only a 5-day buffalo hunt. And each of these guys, these two Californians, were going to hunt a buffalo, and then we had two learners, myself and a guy called Rowan Lewis. So on the first day of the hunt, old California with his camouflage boots was out of action. So he had to stay in camp on the second day because he couldn't walk. His feet were all full of blisters. So the three of us took the second Californian with his 300, with the 375, whatever it was, to hunt a buffalo. And in those days, we were ignorant. We just used to hunt the herd, and we just looked for the biggest buffalo in the herd. And we ambushed the herd as it was slowly grazing along. And I can remember really carefully that the PH and old Rowan took this California guy in, and they were in an ambush position, and I was slightly behind them and slightly to the one side, and this herd of buffalo were grazing towards us, and in that herd was a really respectable herd bull, probably a 9-year-old bull with nice spread. And when it was time for the shooting position, the old PH just tapped the barrel of his double rifle with his wedding ring, and that little metallic click made this buffalo lift his head. And as he lifted his head, this guy shot him exactly in the center of his chest with this nozzle partition, doing that rather impressive velocity. And now I was watching the buffalo through my binoculars, and I actually saw that the dust off the center of the buffalo's chest. I mean, he hit the buffalo perfectly. And that buffalo just dropped to the ground like it had been lightning struck. It just, feet collapsed and it just fell to the ground. And all the other buffalo rolled around, and before anybody could fire a backup shot, this buffalo jumped up and disappeared with the herd, never to be seen again. We tracked that buffalo the rest of that day. We didn't catch up to him. On the third day, we went back and we started the whole tracking process again. And we eventually found where one bull had split off from the herd, and we suspected it was that bull. And we tracked him the whole day. So that was on day 3. We tracked that buffalo the whole day. Gave up in the end. We never found that buffalo. That buffalo was, on the end of the second day, was still very much alive after being shot squarely in the center of the chest with a 300 grain nozzle partition. And my reaction, my eventual conclusion to that was just that velocity was way too fast. That bullet expanded. The buffalo's frontal chest skin is an inch thick at least, and it's got this very loose and supple, so it's got the training effect. I don't believe that bullet actually penetrated into that buffalo's chest cavity. Actually, 1 or 2 small drops of blood from a flesh wound, but that one buffalo lost. And I was still a learner, and that was a real eye-opener to me, because I suddenly realized that, yes, velocity is not everything. Velocity and a less than adequate bullet is certainly resulted in we lost that buffalo. I've said before that a satisfied client is the PH's best form of advertising. So on the 4th morning of the 5-day hunt, the 2 PHs came to the Rowan and myself, the 2 learners, and they said, listen, we need to make a plan, because we've got a client that can't walk, and we've got one client that's already wounded and lost a buffalo, and so we've got to make a plan. So we figured out how we were going to try and get the guy, or we call him flip-flops, because he had to hunt in flip-flops, how to go and get him a buffalo. So there was only one water point in Sapani Pan, and there was an area that had a thick growth of terminalia. Terminalia is quite a tall little tree that grows very densely on white soapy soil. I should imagine, I've never been to Alaska, but it's probably like an Adler thicket in Alaska would probably be something similar to that. And in the middle of this thicket, there was a massive big pod mahogany tree, a huge tree, sticking out head and shoulders above all the rest of these small trees. So we said, we won, and around that tree, we went to look at that tree. Around that tree, there was a clearing about 50 yards in diameter. So we said, okay, we'll make a plan. So we placed old Rowan, the learner PH, and our flip-flops with his 416 Weatherby Magnum. They were just sort of hunkered down at the edge of this clearing. And then the other two PHs and myself, we actually herded a herd of buffalo into that clearing. I mean, I was walking behind the buffalo, and two other PHs were walking on either side of the herd, and by giving them our wind or showing ourselves, it took forever, but we managed to sort of maneuver this herd till eventually it entered into this clearing. I mean, entered into this terminalia thicket. And we could see by the dust the herd was kicking up as it was moving along, that it was heading towards where this tree was. And I was at the back of the herd, and I could see by the dust in front of me, I thought maybe this herd's getting close to where this clearing was, and then all of a sudden I heard this very distinctive kaboom of a 416 Weatherby, and a few seconds later there was a second kaboom, and all the buffalo just turned around and came hardtailing it back, and there I was standing behind this buffalo herd, and this whole herd came running straight towards me.
Oh.
So luckily I found a tree that I little bit, not quite as wide as my shoulders, and I put my back against the tree with my 505 at the ready, and I had buffalo running past me, and it's in spitting distance. I reckon if I could have stepped out, and I could have kicked one of those buffalo that ran past, but they didn't see me. They were running away and getting away from the sound. Then eventually all the dust settled, and while I was standing there waiting for the dust to settle, I heard the very distinctive sound of a death bellow. And a couple of seconds after that, I heard probably a minute or so after the death bellow, I heard a Yankee rebel Yahoo! And then all of a sudden there was this sort of ball of it charging buffalo, and I rode just shouting, shoot, shoot, shoot. And then it sounded like the Second World War started up. And there was the boom of this Weatherby, and old Rowan's, his PH rifle was a 404 Jeffries. And just about 4 or 5 shots, and then dead quiet. So I went belting towards where I heard all the sounds of the shots, and I came to the edge of the clearing, and there was old Rowan and old Flip-Flop standing there, very ashen-faced, and 2 buffalo lying there, with the one buffalo lying exactly with his head on the back of the second buffalo to form a perfect T. So I said to Rowan, what the hell happened? So he said that the plan worked perfectly. So because of to break their outline, he'd got these old flip-flops to sit on the ground just at the outer edge of the clearing on the opposite side as the buffalo were coming towards him. And I warned Rowan, I said, listen, this bloody muzzle blast of this Weatherby, if you're sitting to the side, you're just going to get blasted with a muzzle blast like I'd been. So I said, I suggest you sit behind him. So the two of them were sitting, and Rowan had his legs spread apart and around on either side of our Flip-Flops' back, and our Flip-Flops had the rifle resting on his knee. He had the shooting sticks spread out. And then their plan worked perfectly. As the buffalo started to enter into the clearing, there was a reasonable herd bull in the middle. So Rowan just whistled softly, and the buffalo lifted his head, and our Flip-Flops shot him exactly in the center of his chest with that. There's a 400 grain Swift A-frame on a 416 Weatherby Magnum, so that bullet's been 2,700 feet per second, and that just stunned that buffalo. But because they were sitting on the ground, and those terminalia grows in what we call sodic soil, and sodic soil is almost like white powdery beach sand. It's very light in color and very fine. And of course, sitting on the ground with that muzzle blast, Rowan said that the shot looked like he'd been shooting with a black powder rifle. There was just so much dust, you couldn't see anything. So the two of them jumped up, and they tried to move out of the dust, and they saw this buffalo standing there, still looking sort of dazed, was staggering. So this guy shot him a second time, and his backing shot, as is normally a recommendation, was a 400 grain Barnes Super Solid. And then the second shot also kicked up so much dust that they couldn't see what happened after that. And then when the dust cleared, the buffalo had disappeared. So they were standing there waiting, as you were taught to do in the olden days. So you wait there until your client has had time to smoke 2 cigarettes. when they heard this death bellow. So they started walking towards the death bellow, and the buffalo hadn't gone far. And when they approached the buffalo, it was lying on its side, so Rowan did what he's supposed to do. He approached it from behind, sort of went round to the front, touched the muzzle, touched the eyeball with the muzzle of his 404. There was no reaction, so he leant his rifle against the side of the buffalo and turned towards old Flip-Flops and took off his hat and very respectfully shook his hand and then congratulated him on collecting a fine buffalo. With that, old Flip-Flop let out this Yankee rebel yell, Yahoo! And at that moment, they were charged by a second buffalo. But the second buffalo came for them in a very awkward way. It came from on his front knees, and he was with his backside in the air, and he was propelling himself along with both his back legs. But his front legs, his head was low to the ground, Rose said it looked to him like he'd been charged by a drag car, the drag racing cars. Mm-hmm. So they started shooting, but Rowan, he wasn't even holding his rifle when the buffalo started to charge him. They quickly grabbed his rifle, and luckily old Flip-Flops had his rifle in his hand, but his rifle had a 1.5 to 5 power scope on it, and he had forgotten the scope was still on 5 power. So he's trying to shoot a charging buffalo with a scope on 5 power, and his first shot hit the buffalo. This buffalo had nice drops to its horns, and he hit it through the horn at the bottom of the curl. But they eventually managed to, and then old Rowan they both jumped behind the buffalo that was ready down on the ground, and as the bull got to them, old Rowan shot it in the top of the head, through the top of the boss with his 404, when it actually died with its head on the first buffalo. It actually lay there with its head on. So that hunt resulted in the shooting of 2 buffaloes. And it turned out that second bull had been shot through both his front legs. So he was obviously standing exactly side on to when Flip-Flops took his second shot at the wounded buffalo with that 416 Weatherby. And the solid obviously just whistled straight through and hit the buffalo through his knee on his left leg and then about an inch below his knee on his right leg. So he shot him through both his front legs. So both his front legs were broken, but he still charged them on 2 broken legs and came. So that was, so in the end of the day, the hunt ended quite well. Like there were 2 buffalo, and old Flip-Flops was so chuffed with his second buffalo that he shot through the horn that he actually gave the trophy of his first buffalo to his friend, so they both went home with the buffalo in the end, so everybody was happy. But so that's what it can happen in too much penetration and not enough penetration within a day or so of each other.
My goodness, geez. Well, let's back up a little bit and just talk in very general. I know Africa's big, it's very diverse. There's lots of places where you can have all kinds of different situations, ranging from very, very close to much more open shots in the Kalahari or the Karoo or something like that. Just talk in general about what conditions are often like in Africa, and then the characteristics of some of the most common species of plains game, and we could talk a little bit about dangerous game that's important for guys to keep in mind. And then once we talk about that, we can talk about cartridge and bullet selection, that sort of thing.
Well, I've been thinking about it all that I've shot a fair number of animals in my lifetime, and I reckon 75% of the shots I've taken at every species, from an elephant to springbok, probably 75% of those shots were within 100 meters, up to 100 meters, and I would say about 90% were within 150 meters. And the majority, very few longer than 150 meters. In Africa, I believe 200 meters is a long shot, and 300 meters is about its max shooting distance. Because there are situations, there are a few situations in Africa where you could probably shoot further than that, but the majority of shots, I believe, are certainly within 150 meters, and then the exception is 200, and then the real exception after that is 300. Because most of my hunting I've done was in bushveld conditions, or the Zambezi Valley where the bush is quite thick. But I have also hunted a lot in the Karoo. Even in the Karoo, it's possible to stalk springbok to get within 200 meters or 250 meters of them. And I've hunted in Namibia as well. I've hunted in the Flora Conservancy, which is very dry and arid and open. I've shot spring king stuck there. But, I mean, there at 250 meters still can be considered a long shot. So most of these animals, certainly species like kudu, they are browsers. So you find them in areas where there's browse, and browsers are bushes or trees or shrubs. And you don't often get a really long shot. I know you took a 200-meter shot at a kudu with your marlin. So quite interesting. Today I was looking at a group of roan antelope. They were across one of the canyons on the ranch where I work, and I ranged them, and they were at 229 meters. And I was just looking at them, and I admired you, because I would never consider taking a shot with an open sight at an animal like that. And even a roan is quite a big animal. A roan is the size of an elk. At 229 meters, it just looked big. It looked a long way away to me. And I was watching them through my 10-power binoculars, and maybe guys go to 14 or 15-power scopes, so they make that shot. But sure, that looks a long shot to me.
Yeah, it was. That was a situation where had I known how far away it was, I would not have taken that shot. It was a situation where I think the PH was used to guys shooting a flatter shooting cartridge, and he's like, hold at the top of his back, and with a 30-06 or something like that would have been no problem. And I'd never seen a kudu before or any of that stuff, and so I had no reference for it. It was so much bigger than a deer. I thought it was a lot closer than it actually was, and that day turned into a bit of a rodeo for that reason.
Yeah. No, I can imagine that. But so most of the situation, I believe, is that's the parameter. I would also in the Kalahari, you get what they call the wind blows the sand there into series of parallel sand dunes. They call them streets. So you have a dune, and then you have a little valley, and you have another dune. And from the peak of one dune to the peak of the other dune is exactly 300 meters. So if you're lying on the top of one dune and you can see a hemstock standing on that other dune, it's invariably a 300-meter shot. But, and then you can't, if he goes over that dune, well, then you don't see him anyway. So I've got good friends that go and hunt regularly in the Kalahari, and they all sight their rifles in to be dead on at 250 and know the drop at 300, and they're quite happy with that, and that seems to be sort of adequate for them. They don't find it necessary to take shots further than that.
Yeah, I would say so too, and it seems like just in general in most places in Africa, so I've hunted Namibia, I've hunted Zimbabwe, several different places in South Africa, and my experience for the most part have jived very well with what you're talking about. A lot of things in that 50 to 100 yards, and then a handful, out to 150 yards or thereabouts. It's interesting just the differences between Africa in general and in North America or just other places in the world. In many cases, just the abundance of game is such in Africa where, if you can't get close enough to this animal, whatever it is that you're after, you try and get closer, and if you spook it, no big deal, no need to push a bad situation. We'll try again later today or tomorrow or something like that on another wildebeest or impala or whatever. And it's easier and faster and less painful to do that than it is to risk a 350-yard shot and wound that animal and spend the rest of the day chasing it down.
Yeah, I've been listening to some of the other podcasts, guys hunting in the out west and stuff like that, on these sheep hunts where you spend a week being cold and miserable, and you see one or two sheep, in a week, that type of thing. So you have to take that shot, which is just so different from Africa. I've been on ranches in the Eastern Cape where there are 38 different species of antelope, hunterable species on one ranch. So you just never knew what you were going to bump into. If it didn't work out, there was always something else to go and look for. So you weren't just looking for one animal in a very low population in a very rugged country with awful weather.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And it seems like as well, so we're talking about short-ish shots, call it 50 to 150 meters, and probably, like you said, 95% of the cases there that you're going to run into, with a handful of exceptions, but that's still, all the vast majority of stuff. Let's talk a little bit about just the game. It seems like in general, there's so many species of game over there, even plains game, that are a lot bigger than really anything this size of elk or moose that people are going to hunt in North America. And so it seems like we're dealing with shorter range shots on pretty big and pretty darn tough creatures for the most part.
And with some of them with quite unique anatomical features. You take a blue wildebeest, for example. It's got this big mane and he's got a beard and he's got that hump. And if you look at my anatomy pictures in my book, The Perfect Shot, you'll actually see that his neck, vertebrae in his neck are actually below the horizontal midline on his neck. A hemspock is another perfect example of an animal that's got rather unique. And a lot of people like to take the neck shot, they think how the spine's in the middle of the neck and they shoot him in the middle of his neck and they shoot above the spine and they hit one of what those spinious processes. Those are those finger-like projections that stick up above the 6 cervical vertebrae. And if you hit one of those vertebrae, that animal just drops to the shot. It's just an instantaneous drop. But if you don't put in a backing shot, if that animal gets up and takes off again, in Africa we say you shot his handbrake cable off because he just doesn't stop after that. And it tends to confuse people because these animals look very different, to the elk on the ranch where I work. And I was actually looking at some elk cows this afternoon, and they look quite different to a kudu cow if you had to compare them. They're similar in a way, but they're actually not the same. So the best thing is we never just take that, shoot them on the middle, on the shoulder. That's the shot between Africa. Waste a bit of that shoulder meat, but that's the safest shot on all the species.
One thing that a lot of people will do here, especially, they do it on white-tailed deer, but people also do it on bigger game like elk and moose, is especially if they're using something that's a little on the light side or something like that. I know guys that have killed moose with the 243 or elk or things like that. Is I'll just wait for a broadside shot and I'll slip that bullet in behind the shoulder and it'll just go through the ribs. And if that happens, right, if the animal gives them that shot and they put it where it's supposed to go, they'll hit lungs on that animal and it won't go very far and it will die. And in doing that, you avoid having to shoot through all that heavy muscle in the shoulder or potentially hitting the bone, depending on the angle, that sort of thing. But man, you do that on a blue wildebeest or a kudu or something like that, you stand a darn good chance of just hitting the back of the lungs, or if you go a little bit too far back, just hitting the stomach, and you just don't have nearly the margin of error to the rear on African animals that you do on a lot of North American species of deer.
For sure, I once had a client come and hunt with me. We were hunting buffalo, and he had a 416 Rigby, and he was using the original Kynoch ammunition that had that, that lots of ogive, or that original sort of woodley-shaped bullet. And he shot a buffalo bull high behind the shoulder, and with a solid, and it went straight through. And that buffalo was still alive 48 hours and 20 miles later. We tracked that buffalo for 2 days. And there the buffalo shot through both lungs with a 416 Rigby and a solid, and it was still alive 2 days later. And if we hadn't have found that buffalo, I was convinced that buffalo would have survived. He shot through both lungs with a 416 Rigby.
My goodness. Jeez. Well, let's talk a little bit about, based on the shorter shooting situations and then just the characteristics in general we talked about with game. What sort of characteristics have you discovered or learned in your experience that the most effective cartridges in Africa possess?
Well, if you look at the really good cartridges that have wonderful African reputations, they all have exactly the same makeup. First of all, they all have really bullets with really good sectional density. So I'm talking about 0.33 something. They are bullets with not excessive muzzle velocity. So for the heavier calibers, 2,150 to 2,200 feet per second. For the lighter plains game calibers, something up to 2,500 to 2,700 feet per second. They all have really good knockdown power. That means a good KO value, and they all have for the heavyweights, a KO value of 120 or more is probably desirable. But the most important thing, I believe, certainly for the cartridges or for the big game cartridges, is the cartridges that produce less than 50 foot-pounds of recoil. So it's a combination of having adequate muzzle energy to make them legal. It's a combination of having the right bullet with a good sectional density. It's having enough, but not excessive muzzle velocity. And it's having enough momentum to get the penetration you need with that heavy bullet. It's having enough KO for the dangers. And it's also having less than 50 foot-pounds of recoil, free recoil energy, and less than 20 feet per second of recoil, free recoil velocity. And all the really good cartridges that really perform in Africa, if you break them down, from the 7x57 with a 175 grain bullet to the 220 grain bullet of the 3006 to the 375 to the 416, all the way up, they're all similar. You know, they're not flashy, they're nothing excessive, they're all just moderately effective cartridges that all basically have the same characteristics.
It is funny how that works out, and we could talk about that in more detail here in a second. But I guess let's start from small and work our way up to big and maybe just kind of hit the highlights of a lot of this stuff. I would say it is on the light side for the job, but the smallest thing that I can think of that someone would even reasonably consider bringing to Africa is a 243 Winchester. And so assuming we're in a country that doesn't have a 7mm minimum for plains game hunting, you know, what do you think about that with like an 80 grain Barnes or a 100 grain partition?
If you were limiting yourself to sort of impala-sized animals, we're going to talk about the legal requirements. But in Zimbabwe, for the small plains game, small and medium-sized plains game, the minimum legal caliber was 6mm. So that's darker impala, probably up to reed buck, maybe bushbuck type of animals. They'll work, but I never liked the 243. I've seen some impala shot with the 243 in the Zambezi Valley where the shots were within 100 meters, using a fairly fragile bullet, and you shoot it on the shoulder, and man, you end up feeding half that impala to your dogs, you know, because just that bloodshot. They're just too excessive. For longer shots like in the Kalahari or the Karoo where you're hunting springbok, definitely it's a fairly well-known caliber, but people prefer slightly bigger bullets because the wind can blow like hell in those parts of the world, and there's just too much wind drift with that little 6mm lightweight bullet. So I think it's a wasteful cartridge. It just causes too much meat damage, and I don't know. If you gave me one, I would say thanks, but no thanks. You know, I certainly wouldn't use it.
All right, well, let's bump up a little bit now to the various 6.5 millimeters, the 6.5 by 53, 54, 55, 6.5 Creedmoor, that sort of thing.
Well, that's, you know, the 6.5 by 54 was a very famous cartridge used by Karamoja Bell. You know, he had a Manica schooner that he called it his oily little rascal. Have you heard that term before? Oh,
yeah. I remember that. I talked about that in the book that you loaned me.
And that little... the 6.5 by 54, you know, it shot a 159 grain bullet at sort of 2,220 feet per second. But there again, it's exactly the same thing. I mean, our Bell shot lots of elephants with that. And the reason why that worked, because that bullet's got that magic velocity, but that bullet's got a sectional density of 0.330. I mean, in my cartridge collection, I had some of those cartridges. That bullet's as long as a pencil. It was actually, he did have a few problems with it. The bullet was actually so long that he did have some of them bending. And he preferred the 7mm Mauser and the 303. But he did shoot elephants with that 6.5. So I can imagine it would work really well. But to be told, it's never been a popular caliber in Africa because Africa fell in love with the 7x57. And in the last podcast we spoke about, we'll explain why. That was the cartridge of the Anglo-Boer War. And it just performed so well and it was so effective on everything that people just loved that. So I've never had anybody been out and hunted with the 6.5. I see now the 6.5 Creedmoor is the flavor of the month here in this part of the world.
Oh, yes.
And I was listening to a podcast the other day about elk hunting, and some elk hunters or outfitters now are banning, you're not allowed to hunt an elk with a 6.5 Creedmoor because they just lost too many animals, which to me, I think that's a bit too small for an elk, really. No, I've never hunted an elk, but I look at elk every day now. I've got some magnificent bulls on this ranch, and they certainly are big, impressive animals. And that little 6.5 Creedmoor looks pretty fun to me for an elk.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, I did a whole podcast on this myself, talking with a guy that did it, and then, compared to doing that to a 300 Win Mag, and that's an hour-long discussion, right there with it. But in general, I would agree with you with that. I think the 6.5 Creedmoor is a wonderful deer hunting cartridge, and for deer-sized game, pronghorn, impala, springbok, that sort of thing as well. The interesting thing with those is especially with the 6.5 Creedmoor and the 6.5 Swede, which are really of those are the most commonly used to this day. You can get, say, 140 grain partition, something like that, 140 grain Swift A-frame for it. I know Norma makes factory loads for both of those cartridges using, I want to say, 156 grain bullet. But that gets it right up there with that real high sectional density over 0.3. Let's see what it is here. 0.32, for those cartridges with it, and you're pushing that bullet, 2,600 feet per second. So right in there, I would say it's probably adequate for a lot of stuff, but your margin of error with those cartridges is less than what you're going to get with something that's bigger.
Oh, for sure. And all of a sudden that eland of your lifetime walks out and you've got a 6.5 Creedmoor in your hand. What are you going to do? Go for a brain shot or something like that. It's always better in Africa. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
Well, that's actually a very interesting point that you brought up right now that we probably should have discussed a minute ago, that if you're deer hunting in the United States or you're elk hunting in the United States, that's what you're going to shoot for the most part. There can be a tiny bit of overlap where you have a tag for something else, but it's not like you said you're going to be out impala hunting and then run into an eland, which is a real possibility in Africa, or even a buffalo in some places. And so definitely another consideration to keep in mind if you need to be adequately armed for whatever it is you might reasonably want to shoot if you encounter it out there.
Oh, I totally agree. You've got to be adequately armed for the biggest species on your bag list. I mean, I'm at a situation where my camp staff were complaining they needed some meat, so I grabbed my client and we just went out to look for impala to shoot, and we bumped into the most magnificent buffalo, So, I mean, and luckily he only had a 375, so we loaded the appropriate bullet and he shot the buffalo. So on an impala hunt, you shoot a buffalo, So, and on a buffalo hunt, you can shoot an impala, which has also been like that. You go on a buffalo hunt and you catch up to the buffalo is not what you're looking for, so you're just trudging back to the Land Cruiser, and then all of a sudden you're in a herd of impala, and they go, how about the impala for the fox, and then shoot the impala. So you could do that with your buffalo rifle, but you can't shoot a buffalo with your impala rifle, that's for sure.
How much experience do you have with guys hunting with the 270?
The 270 was never a popular caliber because legally, for the very large dangerous game in Zimbabwe, that's giraffe, eland, and lion was included in that. The minimum legal caliber was 7mm. And then for the large plains game, like kudu all the way down to eland and all that, wildebeest, the caliber was also 7mm, but with a different energy requirement. So the 7mm was basically the legal requirement. And then so you could use the 270, but your 270 was restricted to the small plains game, the impala, blessbuck, bushbuck, that type of thing. So I don't know. And in Namibia, the people liked the 270 for shooting springbok because it was flat shooting, and it also had bucked the wind better than the 6mm calibers, like the 270. The 243.
All right, fair enough. We had a friend of mine, a client, took a 270, hunted in the Bushveld a couple years ago in South Africa, and he ended up having a real good time with it. His shot placement was excellent, and he was using 150 grain Nosler partitions, and so everything. Bullet exited his wildebeest, one-shot kill, and recovered it from his kudu, also one shot. And so I would say, you could probably, like you said, though, assuming it is legal where you are hunting, you can, a good plains game cartridge if you use good bullets and if you know what the heck you're doing with it.
Yeah, and I think definitely 150 grain makes all the difference. I wouldn't like to shoot a wildebeest with a 130 grain bullet in a 270. I think that's just too light.
Well, let's talk about the very famous 7mm Mauser right now. Another cartridge forever linked to Karamojo Bell.
And you can see why it works. I mean, it's just a 175 grain bullet, and the sectional density is 0.310, shooting at 2,300 feet per second, and that thing killed everything. You know, it's killed elephants, it's killed buffalo, it's killed lots of British soldiers. You know, it's just mild-mannered. So my original 7mm, when I bought my set, I couldn't find a 7x57. So my first 7mm was a 7x64, which is probably the equivalent of the 7mm Remington Magnum. And I was still shooting 175 grain bullets, but the waste was just awful. You know, shooting Impala at less than 100 meters, shooting on the shoulder, and the dogs were happy because they got half the Impala type of thing. So then eventually, and on my license for that rifle, all it said was 7mm. That was the caliber. So I took it to the gunsmith and I said, no, man, I don't like the 7x64. It's just too fast for the Zambezi Valley. And he rebarreled it to 7x57. And that was my rifle. And I put it 2 to 7 power variable Leopold VX 2 to 7 power scope on it. And that was fantastic. And I shot everything. And when I got kicked out of Zimbabwe and went back to South Africa, that was my Springbok rifle. You know, and I never changed. I used that rifle like 175 grain bullets. I used PMP Pro-Am. It was just sort of the premium quality bullets made in South Africa. They were just a lead core jacketed bullets. And at those to-date velocities of the 7x57, they just performed beautifully, and I shot everything. And the nice thing, because we used to go on Springbok hunts, they were what we call force hunts, sort of ambush hunts. You know, you were given a shooting position and a firing lane, and then the Springbok were moved around by herdsmen on horseback. Have you heard of this form of hunting, John?
I think you actually talked about it in one of your books, but I have heard about it, yeah.
Yeah, and all of a sudden you're lying, you're shooting Stingray. Next minute there's the most magnificent kudu bull appears, you know. So if you're shooting anything lighter than that, so if I was using a 243 or something like that, you're rather hesitant to take a shot at a magnificent kudu bull. But definitely, I mean, I was on a Springbok hunt, I shot a magnificent kudu bull with my 7x57, and that's right because I was using a 175 grain bullet. So that's just endured in Africa. Everybody just loves it, and to this day it's still popular because it's just mild recoiling. The bullet's got enough bullet weight. The velocity is enough to shoot out to 250 meters if you sight your rifle in adequately. And yeah, everybody just loves it. And so it's the darling of Africa, that's for sure.
Now that 7x64 you talked about, it's a European cartridge. It seems like maybe just a little bit lighter version, or tiny bit slower than the 7mm Remington Magnum, but still pretty fast.
Yes, yeah. And I found it too fast. I just found it too damaging, you know, certainly for the antelope that we were shooting, you know. And it was certainly the distances that we were hunting in. I just said, no, I didn't like it because it was just, and quite a bit more recoil, you know, just more grass. And no, I didn't like it at all. I just said, no, this is excessive. And when I moved over to the 7x57, I never for a day regretted that decision.
It is interesting that a lot of the people I have talked to that are PHs and whatnot in the various African countries, many of them feel the same way about the 7mm Remington Magnum, where they're like, yeah, it'll work, but you know, they don't like it nearly as much as they like, say, the 30-06 or the 7x57.
Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely.
Let's back up real quick. There's a story you have told about Don Heath. I want to say it was Don Heath doing the necropsy on the buffalo cow that had the 7mm Mauser bullet in the heart. Am I remembering that right?
It actually was a buffalo bull, and it was a 303 bullet from a 303. You know.
Okay. Well, that'll lead us right into our 303 discussion. So talk about that real quick.
Are you familiar with the history of the 303?
So I am, but I don't know how many people that are listening to the podcast are.
So the 303 came out in the late, I think, 1888, and it was a 215 grain full metal jacket bullet behind a compressed black powder load. And then in 1902, when cordite became more available, they switched over to cordite, but it's still basically the same ballistics. You know, British was the British Empire, and the sun never set. The sun never set on the British Empire. And the Brits were always fighting wars all over the world. And on this particular occasion, they were fighting a tribe in India, northern India somewhere. And these Indians had the habit of smoking lots of pot, and then they would attack the British with a sword that had sort of a flame shape. It was like a curvy flame-shaped sword. And in those days, the old Brits with their red coats would stand in a line and all stand shoulder to shoulder and shoot at these attacking tribesmen. And that 215 grain .311 caliber bullet actually got a sectional density of 0.318, so it's a really effective bullet. And those would just whip straight through these guys without knocking them down. And only if the central nervous system was hit would the guys fall over. And these guys would then be mortally wounded, would eventually get to the British line and hack at them with these vicious-looking swords before they would finally succumb. So one of the British officers said, hell, these bullets don't work. So at an arsenal called Dum Dum in India, he had hit on the bright idea of cutting the tips off these full metal bullets, effectively turning them into soft bullets. I'm sure that's where old Art Alpin got the idea from for his line load. Anyway, these bullets were suddenly extremely effective because even if you hit the central nervous system, as soon as you hit bodily tissue, the jacket probably peeled back and the lead core came out and it produced a huge knockdown effect and were extremely effective. And some of those bullets actually made their way to South Africa for the Second Anglo-Boer War. And they were referred to as dum-dum bullets. And in South Africa today, if you ask an old Afrikaner about an expanding type bullet, he still refers to those bullets as dum-dum bullets. And of course, the Brits were horrified that there were these, the Boers were horrified that there were the British shooting at them with basically soft point ammunition. And then so much so that if they captured a British soldier that had the dum-dum bullets on his position, they executed him straight away. And then the Germans, around that time, Germans knew that they were going to fight the Brits in a war. So they went and complained to the League of Nations. And I don't know the exact year when the League of Nations was established, but they complained to the League of Nations that there were the British shooting Homo sapiens with soft point ammunition. And in this crazy world of ours, you can blow someone up with an atomic bomb, you can blow them up with a hand grenade, you can do all sorts of things, but you cannot shoot him with expanding type ammunition. So the British got very clever. The Brits are clever people. So they reduced the bullet rate to 274 grains, and the front third of the bullet, they replaced it with a balsa wood cap, which they then covered in a metal wash, with a copper wash. So it looked like a non-expanding type of bullet. And those bullets were designed to tumble because the rear of the bullet was heavier than the front. And with the Homo sapien, your heart's only a couple of inches from the front of your chest. And even if you're wearing a thick army woolen coat or something like that, bullet, as soon as it hit some form of resistance, the bullets tumbled. So they were designed to tumble. So they would go through the human body tumbling, which was very effective in knockdown. And the Brits used those bullets for the First World War and the Second World War. Also mentioned when I was in Zimbabwe, my father-in-law had an aeroplane, and he was a pilot in the Police Reserve Air Wing. He managed to mount a Browning 303 machine gun in his Cessna 180 because he didn't like these guys shooting at him. So when I got to Zimbabwe, he had boxes and boxes of this 303 ammunition, and I had an old managed to purloin an old 303 method, and I used that rifle to shoot the very first buffalo that I ever shot, and I used some of that military ammunition. And that buffalo, when I shot the first shot, hit it in the heart, and I eventually did an autopsy on that buffalo. That 303 bullet was in the heart of that buffalo, but it was pointing backwards. I could see the base of the bullet was sticking into the heart, and the tip of the bullet was pointing backwards. So I cut some of those bullets in half just to see what they looked like. And every one of those bullets, the front third of it had an aluminium cap on it. So they were designed to tumble. So the 303 was designed to kill Homo sapiens, and it was known as the wounder of game because if you didn't get a perfectly broadside on shot and you shot an animal with a 303 with a military round, those bullets always tumbled, and there were lots of reports of those bullets wounding lots of animals. But if you use the 215 grain bullet, if you go back to a really good quality 215 grain bullet, the 303 is a wonderful performer. It's very similar to the 7x57. It's a 215 grain bullet. The bullet diameter is 0.311, and it's shooting at like 2,200 feet per second, something like that. A very effective cartridge. So much so that a lot of the old elephant hunters used that combination to kill lots of elephants. They were very effective on elephants, and I can see why, because you've got a full metal jacket bullet with a good sectional density at a modest velocity. And why Karamoja Bell liked that rifle is because it came with a 10-round magazine, so you could shoot multiple elephants in it if you got into a herd. So that was a very effective cartridge with the 215 grain bullet.
And so, for the listener, talking about, especially those that have served in the military or, heard the talk about why we can't use any kind of expanding ammunition, a soft point or anything like that in military operations. So that's the story Kevin just told about where that came from. And it's actually, a lot of people think it's the Geneva Convention, but it's actually the Hague Convention of 1899 that prevents that deal. And so, like,
the Hague Convention, not the League of Nations. Yeah, I got it wrong.
Yeah. But everyone signed the convention in Hague for it. But so, interesting piece of trivia with that stuff. And so that covers the 303 British really well. I can't imagine it's nearly as popular as the 7mm Mauser or the 303 British, but what about the 8mm Mauser? Do you have what are your thoughts on it?
Well, it's very good. When I spent some time in Namibia, and that was a very popular caliber in Namibia because the majority of the farmers in Namibia were of German descent and German origin. Yeah, it was 8mm, but it's a confusing cartridge as well because there are two versions of the 8mm. There's the 8mm J, which was the military cartridge, and the bullet diameter is 0.318 of an inch. And then there's the JS, where the bullet diameter is 0.323 of an inch. So you've got to be really careful. If you get an 8mm, you've got to figure out exactly what your bore diameter is, because the last thing you want to do is to shoot a bullet with 0.323 of diameter through a 0.318 barrel. That's going to give you a bit of a surprise, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
But it was to do with, after the First World War, the Germans were not allowed to make any more military calibers, so all they did, they took the 318 and they just increased the diameter of the bullet slightly to 3. So it's a very effective caliber. It's the German version of the 3006. It shoots a 195 or 200 grain bullet. It's reasonable velocity, and it's a very effective certainly for the shorter hunting, the shorter distances. It was an effective cartridge. It wasn't never really common in South Africa, but certainly in Namibia it was fairly common caliber.
Now, I don't want to spend too much time on either one of them because I know especially the 30-06 is super popular over there. But 308, 30-06, 300 Win Mag. I mean, it seems like those are all three of them, especially the darn 30-06, are just real solid performers there, especially when you're using 180, 200, 220 grain bullets.
Quite interesting. I spent some time in Namibia, and I got to know the guys at the gun shop there. And because Namibia's got, Windhoek, the capital, has got some fantastic gun shops. And the most popular cartridge sold in Namibia is the 300 Win Mag. That was the most popular caliber. Followed then by 3006 and others, but definitely the 300. Everybody loved the 300 Win Mag there. That just 300 Win Mag is the 3006 on steroids. Just a little bit faster, a little bit flatter shooting. Mm-hmm. And they loved it. But all of those 180 grain bullets up to sort of 165 in the 308 and 180 grain in the 3006. But what I really liked the 3006 was the 220 grain. And those big old round nose. I think they were Remington Corlocks or something like that. I think.
Yeah, that's probably the most common factory load with that heavy of a bullet weight in the 30-06 these days. Yeah. Maybe a Federal Power Shock is available that heavy too, but yeah, that round nose, works great and on big game and close range. Yeah,
that 220 grain bullet's got a sectional density of 0.331. So there we are. That's back in the same old pocket again. That's why it works so well, because it's got all those factors: not excessive velocity, really good sectional density, heavy for caliber, lots of momentum, nice big bullet, expands to large diameter, it's got the momentum to drive it to the skin on the opposite shoulder. Yeah, so that's just why they work. There's nothing. it's not rocket science to figure out why these calibers just work.
Well, speaking of high sectional density cartridges, or cartridges that use high sectional density bullets, you got the 318 Wesley Richards and the 333 Jeffrey now. A little bit more obscure these days, but I imagine they were pretty darn effective 100 years ago, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The 250 grain bullet of the 318 Wesley Richards, the bullet diameter is actually, that sectional density is 0.328, and then the 250 grain of the 33 Jeffrey, the sectional density is 0.322. So you're right up there. But that 333 Jeffrey, also you could get a 300 grain bullet in there.
My goodness.
And
wow.
and that was a sectional density of way up there. I don't know exactly what it is. I think the density is like 3.5 or something like that, 3.56 or something. So, and there were lots of people that shot elephants with that. And I can see why it worked, because it was just massive amount of penetration. So the equivalent of these rifles now is probably the 33806. It's probably the closest, what would you call it, closest modern day version of it. And I think that would be a fantastic cartridge for the larger species in bushveld conditions.
It's funny that you mentioned that. The guys I work with in South Africa, their most popular client rifle is a 338 Winchester Magnum that they have a big suppressor on, and then they download it a little bit using 225 grain Barnes bullets. And so muzzle velocity is a little slower than it would be on factory loads, but man, it hits hard, and it's super effective at close range like that.
Yeah, I can imagine. So that's just basically that's equivalent of a 33806, really, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And kind of, I'm sure in that same vein, you have the 35 Whelen, which is a 30-06 instead of at the 338 caliber. It's necked up a little bit more to 35.
It's a cartridge that sort of never caught on in Africa. I know about it, but I've never even shot it. I actually have shot a rifle. I've shot it. My friend it was his favorite elk rifle, or Monte Calagres. My friend that had the safari shooting school. His favorite elk rifle was a 35 Wheeler, and I forget the ballistics of it now, but it was fantastic. Just more knockdown power than a 30-06, bigger bullets, heavier. I should imagine it could work really well.
There was a story I've told in some of my emails to guys on my list before, but I'll tell it again here briefly. My grandfather got an old surplus Mauser and had it rebarreled to 35 Whelen, and he was using, I want to say, like a 250 grain Hornady soft point or something like that. Nothing real special of a bullet. And he shot what ended up being the biggest white-tailed deer he ever killed in his life with it. And it was a straight-on shot. And so he shot it in the chest. And he was really excited to recover this bullet from that deer, and he wanted to see what it looked like. And he told me the story about how they were, in their field dressing it, they were looking real carefully and looking and getting further and further into the back, and then they rolled it over and saw the big bullet hole in its ham where it exited exited that whitetail, and was like, oh well, I guess we're not going to be recovering that that bullet after all.
No, I can understand why. Big heavy bullet, lots of momentum. And the whitetail is not all that of an animal anyway, so
no, it wasn't, and that was his first experience with something other than a 30-06 or something like that, and so it was had no idea what to expect. Now I imagine that the reason why, say, the various 338s and 35s are less popular in Africa is they're kind of in that in between zone, right? There are plenty of things that are smaller that work great on plains game, but that stuff, as good as it is, not good enough for or not big enough, especially to be legal on dangerous game, especially like buffalo. So let's talk about the various 9.3 millimeter cartridges now.
Well, the 9.3 by 62, that's just the darling of Southern Africa. The guys love it, and it just works well, and it's legal in Zimbabwe, and I've spoken about it before. But I've had one for 3 decades, and that rifle shot 650 buffalo, and it just worked. With solids from sidearm, you'd always find the solid under the skin on the far side of the shoulder. From the tricky frontal chest shot, I used to use 300 grain bullets in my 9.3, and I shot them at 2,300 feet per second. So the 300 grain bullet in a 9.3 has got a sectional density of 0.320, I think, which is where it needs to be. And it just worked. I mean, we shot everything with it except an elephant, and it just worked. Reasonable recoil, and my 9.3 weighed 10 pounds, and that used to recoil at 28 foot-pounds of recoil energy. So extremely shootable. So I had quite a few female clients, and they all used that rifle with no problem. They all loved it. I had my other client's rifle was a 7.5 or just under 8-pound Browning A-bolt, Browning Medallion A-bolt, and my clients did not like that rifle at all because it was just with full factory C75 ammunition. It just recoiled too much. So I used to download that ammunition with a 300 grain bullet. I downloaded the 2350, and that really reduced the recoil. But I also believe it made the bullets perform better as well. And then it became a really effective rifle with shooting a 300 grain bullet at 2,350 a second. But the other 90 by 64. So the 90 by 74R. That's just the rimmed version of it's not the 74R, it's just the rimmed version of the 90 by 62. Exactly the same ballistics. So whatever you say about the 90 by 62, you can say about a 90 by 74R. The 370 Sarco, I just believe those bullets are just going too fast. And if I had to use a 90 by 64 or a 90 by 66, which is the Sarco, you're shooting those bullets at 375 Holland velocities, which with that little bullet, I would think if you wanted to use one of those, I would go to 300 or even a 320 grain bullet. And then because there was a time when you could get 320 grain .366 bullets from Woodley, and that would be my recommendation for those faster round threes. But all the other ones were never as popular as the 93 by 62. And as you've got experience of yours, you found it absolutely adequate on Buffalo and shootable, and it's got all the right balance of all the properties to make it a really effective, easy shooting cartridge.
If I had to choose one rifle that I had to hunt with everything for the rest of my life, that would probably be it.
Yeah, I could agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you talked a little bit about we've talked actually at length in previous podcasts about the 375 H&H. Have your thoughts changed on the 375 Ruger now that it's been around for a little while longer?
Not really. I just still think 2,660 feet per second is too fast for that 300 grain bullet. I would just slow it down a bit and put a slightly heavier bullet in it. But I think the C75 is just so popular. I don't know. I would have nothing against it. I certainly wouldn't go out and buy one. I'd rather buy a 375 H&H. I've got a 375 H&H. I've got a Winchester Model 70, bought new in 1988, and I was given to me in absolutely unfired condition. So I'm a very proud owner of a Winchester Model 70. One of the good ones, they tell me.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the 375 Ruger is that since it has that little bit larger case capacity, like you said, it will shoot that bullet faster with that longer barrel, but with a shorter barrel, say like a 20-inch barrel, something like that, you're actually getting almost exactly 375 H&H velocities, but with 3-4 inch shorter barrel, and that seems to like we talk about, same weight bullet at the same velocity, it's going to do the same thing. And so in this case, you can have it a little bit handier rifle, and the benefit, at least these days, say to an American hunter that doesn't already have a 375 H&H of some sort, there just aren't that many options. You can get a Winchester Model 70, and that's really about it that is in current production. You can find older stuff, the old CZs and the old Rugers and whatnot. But if you're an American and you want a dangerous game rifle, you either can go with the 375 H&H or a 416 or a 458 in the Model 70, or you can get a 375 Ruger. It seems like in one of the Ruger rifles.
They're good rifles. They've got that. I just thought the one that I handled was too light for. And I didn't explain, but if they make them a bit heavier. Now, any rifle that shoots a 300 grain bullet downrange at even 2,500 feet per second, that rifle needs to weigh at least 10 pounds. If it doesn't weigh 10 pounds, that recoil is just unpleasant. And I don't know, is it possible to get a modern Ruger to weigh 10 pounds, you think?
I don't know if it'll weigh 10 pounds, but it'll weigh probably more than 9 pounds. It'll weigh, say 9.5 pounds thereabouts with a scope on it and all of that stuff. Along with that 338 I just mentioned, my guys in Africa have a Ruger guide gun and 375 Ruger, once again with a nice scope and with a suppressor on it, and it's a darn effective rifle.
I should imagine that suppressor probably adds another pound on it to it anyway, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And so you lose that advantage of the shorter barrel by putting a big old suppressor on the end of it. But yeah, it takes all of that muzzle blast out of it and a good chunk of the recoil out too, and it just makes it heavier.
That would be a very thick component. No, I would have no problem with that,
Mm-hmm. Now, you want to talk about something that's too darn light, though. Man, I'll bet that 376 Steyr in Jeff Cooper's scout rifle, if it actually weighed 7 pounds like he wanted it to, I'll bet that would just be brutal to shoot.
Well, I've got an interesting story about that. I had a client who wanted to come and hunt a buffalo with me, and he was I think he had Jeff Cooper tattooed on his chest. He was an absolute fan of Jeff Cooper. He could quote him, word for word. And he said, I'm going to come and hunt this buffalo with my 376 Steyr, the scout rifle, my Mannlicher schooner. So that's fine. On one condition, that you can get it to shoot a 300 grain bullet at 2,350 feet per second. If you can't do that, then you've got to do something else. And he was working up his loads, and he took a shot, and the barrel of his Steyr Mannlicher fell off because they'd not threaded in. They pressed in. So that barrel fell out of the action of his scout rifle.
Oh, my goodness.
I sent him a box of 380 grain rhinos. And long story short, just as well I did, because he ended up, here's the guy that tore his Achilles tendon, and we had a terrible hunt, but he eventually shot at buffalo, shot through the tree, and buffalo hit, the bullet tumbled and hit the buffalo on the scapula. The buffalo sat down, and I shot it. But anyway, if he hadn't been using 380 grain rhinos, he would have lost that buffalo. We ended up having a successful hunt. So, I'm not impressed with the 376 Steyr Wood Mannlicher schooner rifle. If the barrel falls out of the rifle, geez, something's got to be seriously wrong.
Oh, my goodness, man.
Write that off, boy. Yeah.
We can go back in time now to some of these older cartridges again, with the 404 Jeffrey, 425 Wesley Richards. You talked about the 416 Rigby, but, I mean, it seems like they all share all those characteristics, right? And especially with these, you got the larger caliber, 40 plus caliber bullets, high sectional density, all shooting bullets in that same muzzle velocity. That's why they're so darn effective and have such good reputations, right?
Oh, for sure. But the truth be told, the 404 Jeffreys did all the work in Africa. And there's certainly a reason for that, because that was the standard cartridge of all the game departments of all the British colonies. So Northern Rhodesia, Nyasaland, all the British colonies, the standard issue rifle for all the game departments was the 404 Jeffreys. And there was a reason for that, because first of all, they were made in really reliable Mauser type actions. There were Vickers, Armstrong, and Wesley. A lot of the good old British, not famous but well-known British gun makers made 404 Jeffreys. And it was a cartridge shooting a 400 grain bullet at 2,150 feet per second. And it just worked because for a 10-pound rifle, the recoil was less than 50 foot-pounds, and they could use that to train African game scouts. So these are African game scouts that were sent out on problem animal control, and they could teach these guys who had no experience in firearms to learn to shoot a dangerous game rifle really effectively. So the 404 Jeffreys did all the work in Africa, but the 416 Rigby gained all the glory because he was written about by Robert Roark, And that's another interesting story. Robert Roark came and hunted with Harry Selby, and Harry Selby was a young professional hunter, and his rifle was a 450 double, and he happened to have his client shoot a buffalo in an area where there were absolutely no trees, and the buffalo was lying, and they were busy starting to skin this buffalo, and there was nothing to lean his rifle up against, so he just had it lying on the ground, and his boss, Donald Kirk, came driving up in a safari car and drove over his double and bent the barrels.
Oh.
So when he got back to Nairobi, he was going on another safari in a couple of days. So he quickly went into the gun shop there and said, "Listen, hell, I need a rifle because my 450's got barrels are bent, and they happen to have a 416 Rigby on a standard Mauser action that had been opened up." And so it's only a big rifle. He bought it and then fell in love with that rifle. and took Robert Ruark on his hunt. And Robert Ruark became a well-known author and wrote a book called Uhuru, Something of Value. Have you read those books, John?
I've read both of them, yep.
And so I forget the name of the PH there that he writes about in his books. I mean, he modeled that character on Harry Selby. And Harry Selby, he described hunting those mau-maus with a 416 Rigby, and that set everybody, that made the 416 famous. Just like Hemingway in the story of the Short Happy Life of Francis Macumba made the 505 gig famous. It's just amazing how people's perceptions. But the 404 and the 416 Rigby, the only difference was that the 404, I believe, the bullet, the diameter of the 404 bullet is 0.423, which is, and it's a 400 grain bullet, so you down below 0.32 on sectional density, as opposed to the 410 grain bullet of the original 416 Rigby had a 0.416 caliber, so the sectional density was 0.338, and I think that made the real difference. But I've got a game ranger friend in the Kruger National Park, and his everyday carry rifle that he uses for all his problem animal control, he uses a 404 Jeffries, and he loads it with 450 grain Gilzombo solid bullets at 2,150 feet per second. And he says that does everything he needs. He gets full body penetration on elephants. He has to take an angling shot on a hippo or anything like that, and they think that works. And those extra 50 grains just absolutely change the performance of the 404. And it's still a wonderful cartridge. Low chamber pressure in a 10-pound rifle. It's still going to recoil at less than 50 foot-pounds, so suitable, and just got all the characteristics that you really need.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting. I'm looking at your cartridge table right now in Africa's Most Dangerous, and going down the list, that recoil energy is going up, and then it just drops right off from the 60s and even up to 80 down into the 40s when you get to the 404 Jeffrey there.
Yeah, and that's the secret. That's why that was so. But I can imagine, if I'm correct in my assumption, that the 416 Rigby only produced 2,150 feet per second instead of 2,770, and I'm sure that 416 Rigby also recoiled pretty similar amount of recoil. And that's probably why it really worked, and it was so, everybody loved it because it was just so effective, because I reckon they could shoot it really well.
Yeah, it's amazing how that works. Well, let's talk about the 450-400 now. That is something that I've heard you talk about extensively in some of the podcasts and then our talks at Condor Taxidermy. And considering how effective that cartridge seemed to be, I'm actually kind of amazed that it's not more popular.
Well, it's a rim cartridge, so it's really only effective in double rifles and in single shots. Mm-hmm. And, we also spoke about the 470. Everybody thinks there's something magical about the 470 Nitro Express. So if guys are really eventually can afford a double, he immediately thinks that, my PH is, I'm going to hunt an elephant, and my PH uses a 470, so I'm going to use a 470. So they sort of jump in at the deep end. And I actually wrote an article for Heim to try and convince Heim first-time double rifle buyers to say, hey, listen, the logical choice is to start your first double should be the 450-400. And once you've mastered that and learned how to shoot a double, if you want a 470, go up to it. But I believe it is quite a lot popular. But I think another reason is people look at those rather anemic ballistics. They've got a 400 grain bullet in 2,150 feet per second. Got a good sectional density of the bullet, 0.338. But it just, people got excited about muzzle energy when they were BS by Roy Weatherby. So I think it sort of got glossed over because it's just not flashy enough. But if the truth be told, it's probably one of the most effective and manageable cartridges out there. The recoil is manageable. In a 10-pound double, you'll less than 50 pounds of recoil. Got fantastic penetration, good section density, not too much. It's got all the characteristics. And they became available in a Ruger No. 1 at one stage. And I don't know what those Ruger No. 1s weighed. Have you any idea what a Ruger No. 1 in that sort of caliber would weigh, John?
Well, give me 1 second. I'll look it up for you.
Because, if you're talking about an 8 or 9 pound rifle, it's not going to be pleasant. But if that Ruger No. 1, you can get it to weigh 10 pounds, I think that would be a fantastic combination. There was also a bit of confusion with the with the 450-400, because some of the bullets came out 0.408 diameter, and then but the bullets nowadays are made 0.411. But if you bought an old 450-400, you had to have the bore slugged to find out what exactly your bullet diameter was. So there was quite a bit of confusion about the different actual bullet diameters with that caliber, which could have contributed to being not so desirable.
It seems like here 9.25 pounds slick.
Yeah, so with a scope on it, and
yeah. So yeah, I mean, right up there with what you think it should weigh. And so I imagine we don't have to spend too much time on it, but I imagine that the 416 Remington, that extra velocity is you may be doing more harm than is good with maybe erratic bullet performance and that extra recoil compared to, say, the 416 Rigby then.
No, I think the Rigby actually recoils more than the Remington if you take same bullet weight, same velocity, because it takes 20 grains more powder with the 416 Rigby with that voluminous case to get to that same velocity. So the modern day 416 Rigby, shooting a 400 grain bullet at 2,350 feet per second, that's being recoiled at about 60 foot-pounds of recoil energy in a 10-pound rifle. And I believe that there's an aura about the 416, but I don't think you need all that velocity to get it to work really well. If the history of the cartridge has got anything to go by.
Let's take a look here and see what published stuff is for the 416 Remington. Federal's advertising 2,400 feet per second with a 400 grain bullet for the 416 Remington, and then 2,350 for the Rigby with the same weight bullet. So probably, you can get that much variation going from rifle to rifle with a certain ammo.
But I think the Remington has quite a lot more chamber pressure, doesn't it?
I would let me check here. I'll bet you are right.
Before after the experience you told about when we pulled the extractor off that Remington M700, I was very wary of little fingernail extractors and high pressure cartridges. That's for sure. So, but I think in a Mauser type action with a 416 Remington, it's got a wonderful reputation. It's just the same ballistics. But I've just had a friend go on an extensive hunt in Mozambique. And he used a Winchester 416 Remington, and we got John Sala Safari Ammunition to load it with 430 grain North Fork soft point and North Fork flat nose solids. And we had a velocity between 2,150 and 2,200 feet per second. And he said every PH, he went to 3 different countries. He shot like 3 buffalo and 2 leopards and whole full bag. And said every PH that he hunted with was blown away by the terminal performance of a 430 grain 416 bullet doing that sort of moderate 2,150 feet per second velocity. So they couldn't believe it was how effective it was.
Okay, so to your point, the 416 Rigby has a chamber pressure of 55,000 psi from SAMI. 52,000 psi, whereas the 416 Remington is 65,000. So yeah, big difference.
Yeah. Anyway, but I certainly, and you can get a 416 Remington in the post, this new Winchester Model 70, the Super Express, and I think that's a wonderful option for someone that wants something more than a 365.
Well, for those that want a little bit more, we can talk a little bit about the 450 Nitro Express and kind of how everything that descended from that.
Well, that's the one that started it all. And I have mentioned I've got a game ranger friend that he uses that's his carry rifle in the Kruger Park. It's a 450 Nitro Express doing 500 grain bullet doing 2,200 feet per second. And he says it's everything he needs. He gets full body length penetration on difference. He uses the Zomba bullet. And he said it just works well. And then we did it, one of the previous podcasts, we compared the 450 to the 470. And I think as I said before, from a hunting perspective, from a safari client perspective, if you want to shoot a 500 grain bullet at 2,150 feet per second, the 450 Nitro Express is a better option than the 470 Nitro Express.
Now, with this cartridge, though, the only hang-up on it is that, once again, it's rimmed, and so you have to use it either in a single shot or a double, though, right?
Oh, yeah, it's for double rifles. I mean, some people do put it into a Ruger number one in a sort of a custom job and something like that. But this is primarily for double rifles. And, we've spoken about Heim and Bernie Caron and things like that. And these doubles are really good value for money these days.
And so the original ballistics of that cartridge, at least published by Konak, what was their lie that they were telling everyone with the velocity for that cartridge? 2150 feet per second with a 480?
I think that it was. And so that was probably being like 2,000 feet per second with a 480. But everybody thought it was the best thing since sliced bread, because that was the transition from 4-bore and 8 black powder rifles to for the elephant hunters. And I think that even the 480 grain, the sectional density is 0.37, I think it is, or something like that. So it's sort of, even the 480's got a pretty decent sectional density. But I've never had anybody even test an original Konak 450, 400 for velocity. But I could imagine if all those others were a bit slower, it was probably doing just on 2,000 feet per second. But it seems to work, and it probably worked because of that good sectional density of that 480 grain bullet.
Yep, and so then to take the next step, Winchester decides they want to have a cartridge that duplicates that performance, but have it in a standard linked action, bolt action rifle, so a guy can go over there and use that instead of having to use a double, and that's just a little bit too much stuff to cram into that case size for the powders they had available at the time, and they had some issues from the beginning, didn't they?
They certainly did. I had a friend, Ken Stewart, that I mentioned. He was a bullet maker. He was actually on the original Safari as a PH when Winchester brought that ammunition out to test. And the powder loads were so compressed, they had to glue the bullets into the cases. Otherwise, the compressed powder was just pushing the bullets out. And then we had the old Jack Lott had that problem, and then he discovered the problem of all the powder congealed into lumps, and there was horrible stories of bullets bouncing off elephants' heads and bullets seen rolling across the ground. And for a time, the ballistics of the 458 Win Mag were sort of downgraded to a 500 grain bullet at 2,040 feet per second, and it still seemed to work. But surprisingly, the 458 Win Mag survived all that bad publicity, and it's now extremely good and extremely effective because with modern day powders, it does. I was looking at one of the Hornady bullets. They've got a 500 grain going at like 2,200 feet per second. So, and as I've said many times before, for dangerous game professional hunting, the minimum ballistical recommendation of the Zimbabwe Professional Hunters Association was a 500 458 bullets doing 2,150 feet per second. And now you got there are many different options, but that was the recommended minimum. And if you couldn't handle the recoil, if you couldn't handle that ballistic combination, well, then you needed to find another job, because you had to be able to shoot that combination really accurately. And we had lots of young ladies that wanted to come and become guards, and they could learn to shoot that combination very effectively.
Yeah, so Hornady advertises that 500 grain DGS and DGX bonded at 2140 for the 458 Win Mag with a 24-inch barrel. So yeah, you're right at the upper limits of that cartridge. You're getting right up to your minimum recommended for that stuff. But with the little bit longer cartridge case with the 458 lot, instead of that being at the upper end of it, it's kind of right in the middle of the sweet spot for what works real well with it.
Oh yes, so everybody, the standard, most guys just used to buy Bruno or CZ 458 Win Mags, and then just have them reamed out with 458 lot. And there was a gunsmith in Harare, and he could just ream them out through the breech end, so you didn't have to take the barrel off. He charged you a couple $100, and everybody went that route. And then they would just fire form 375 H&H cases into that, and they never had to trim those cases. They just go from there. And it was very easy to get 2,150 feet per second with that slightly longer case.
And so we've talked about both of these on the podcast before, so I don't want to spend too much time with them. But we got the 470 Nitro and the 505 Gibbs seem to be the next step up that are at least in kind of common use in Africa, somewhat common use in Africa.
Oh yes, and then you left out the 500 Wesley Richards, the I'm having a brain fart here. 425 Wesley Richards. No, sorry, 500 Wesley Richards. And the 500 Nitro Express as well.
Let's talk about all of them.
Oh, they were basically the same. The 505 Gibbs came out with the 525 grain bullets, which I thought was too light because the sectional is only .294. So as soon as 600 grain bullets became available, I went on to the 600 grain bullets in my 505 with sectional density .334, I think, or something like that, and that just changed that rifle completely. The 500 Jeffries and the 500 Nitro Express use 570 grain bullets. That's the same sort of velocity. So also the sectional density is in the low 0.3 something. Then they have a wonderful, both have good reputations. Tony Sanchez was a very famous Spanish hunter, and he was he really liked his 500 with Richards. But that cartridge has got a rebaited grip, and you really have to know what you're doing to allow the action to really feed well on a rebaited rim. And the nice thing about a 505 Gibbs, it doesn't have a rebaited rim, and of course the 500 Nitro Express is a rim cartridge for doubles. But they're all pretty similar. But I think my 505 Gibbs with the 600 grain at being 2,140 or 2,150 feet per second was better than both of the others, because both the others only had 570 grain bullets.
All right, what about let's talk about the super, super heavy stuff now, the 577 Nitro.
It works, but it's just too darn heavy. You've got to carry one of those rifles around. I mean, a 577, the starting weight of a double is 14 pounds, And as we've mentioned before, there's a huge difference between carrying a 10-pound rifle and a 12-pound rifle. But when you go to 14 pounds, well, now you're really pushing it. I know one PH guy called Cliff Walker. He carries a 577, but he's a muscle-bound freak. He can handle it, and he's very muscular, very fit and strong. But do you carry a 14-pound rifle for all day? And I had experience with that because I had a friend whose father had a Wesley Richards 577, and he couldn't get ammo for it, so he sent the rifle to Furlack, and they made a set of .458 Win Mag barrels, but he wanted the same barrel profile, so the barrels are much thicker, and that rifle weighed 14 pounds. And we were on a lion hunt, and just at dusk one evening, saw a whole herd of buffalo, and next minute this most magnificent lion ran across the road, started to chase one of these buffalo. So we thought, this is going to be a piece of old cake. The lion's going to kill a buffalo. We'll just sneak in the next morning and shoot the lion. And well, that didn't happen. And that lion chased that buffalo for about 10 miles. And that 14-pound rifle wore out 3 people carrying it. And I was carrying my 505 Gibbs, which weighed 12 pounds. It was fully loaded, and I was fine. But those 2 extra pounds wore out the guy that owned the rifle, his father, and one of the game scouts. That 14 pounds was just awful to carry for that length of time. So I learned a good lesson that there's a sort of upper limit to how much a rifle can weigh. And 14 pounds is just too heavy to carry all day, that's for sure.
For at least guys over here, a lot of guys are dealing with, say, an 8-pound rifle if you're going to be hunting with deer or something like that. And a 10-pound rifle to, say, your average hunter that's not used to it it's noticeably heavier. It's not terrible, but it's noticeably heavier, but you can get used to it. But, a 14-pound rifle, that's 40% heavier than an already heavy-ish rifle. And even with a 14-pound rifle, you're still dealing with a ridiculous amount of free recoil energy in that cartridge with the 577.
So I think the truth be told, the 577 was your get-out-of-danger sort of situation. And most of the guys that used them probably had a gun bearer that carried it. And when he needed it, if he had a wounded elephant or something like that, then he'd break out his 577. But he didn't carry that thing all day because you couldn't carry it. And I've been enjoying these mountain rifle podcasts where the guys are talking about 4.5 and 5 pound rifles and all that. So you start thinking about a rifle that weighs 14 pounds. It's just crazy.
It makes me tired just thinking about it. We had a guy come over a couple years ago that hunted with, it was not a real 5.77 nitro. It was some sort of a custom job that he did that was using a cartridge that was a custom cartridge that was almost up on that level, but wasn't going quite as fast. But even in that rifle, but in the other deal was that rifle was quite a bit lighter than 14 pounds. It was probably say 10 pounds or something like that. And I remember that rifle just beat the heck out of him over there, even though it wasn't shooting full house loads. I did see a video of him shooting a buffalo with that thing though, and that buffalo looked like it got hit by a car when he shot it.
Yeah, I can imagine. A novelty thing, but it's not a serious cartridge, not a serious contention, that's for sure.
Well, is that how you feel about the 600, and I imagine probably especially the 700 nitros as well?
Well, the 600 weighs 16 pounds, so you just another 2 pounds, and then the 700 Nitro Express, I mean, I handled one and it weighed 23 pounds. I'm quite a big, strong guy. I battled even to pick it up and hold it, to aim it. So how you would carry that on an elephant hunt where you expected to walk 20 miles in a day, I just don't think. I think it's just a novelty, just to have to say that we made it. But there's no real sensible application for certainly for the 700. 600, people didn't really like the 600 because they said that the 5.77 was better because the 600 lacked penetration. But now you've got to be a big, strong guy. And the days of gun bearers are over. Nobody's going to employ a gun bearer just to walk around with a. And they used to carry them around in their rifle cases, and so they didn't get scratched and messed up. Have a sweaty hands on it all day, and then if they needed it, they'll break open his very nice oaken leather case and then take out reassemble his rifle and go try and look for a wounded elephant. Those were good old colonial days.
Do you know how many 600 nitro rifles Holland and Holland made?
I do not. I don't. It can't be many. It can't be triple figures, I'm sure.
I read somewhere, I don't remember what it was, but yeah, it was a small number. And gosh, I want to say that I heard a story that there was a guy that wanted them to make him another 600 nitro custom, and they refused to do it. And so I think that may actually be the story of the 700 nitro.
That's the guy, Bull Feldstein and Jim Bell. I know the story well, because Holland made their last 600, and they said this will be the last one we'd ever make. And then Paul Feldstein went to them and said, "Well, I want you to make me a 600, and we can't. We signed an agreement not to make any more." So they said, "Okay, we'll make me a 700 then." And they designed it and made a 700. It's a 1,000 grain bullet at 2,000 grain bullet at 2,000 feet per second. So, but funny enough, the 1,000 grain 700 caliber bullet only got a sectional density of 291. So, and I also believe that they went and shot an elephant with it for the first time, and a side brain shot and missed the brain, and the 700 didn't even knock the elephant down. So it didn't work all that well. I think just because I could imagine what it's like trying to aim a 23-pound rifle. It was just stupid in my opinion. But then you've got lots of money, you can do stupid things, I suppose.
Well, for the listener, there is a YouTube video floating around out there of a guy, I want to say at the Dallas Safari Club, shooting a lot of these rifles. And I think he shoots a 700 nitro in that video. And you can see he handles the recoil well, but it is still just absolutely ferocious.
I shot a 700 once. I shot I think it's I shot a 600 Overkill. There's a cartridge called a 600 Overkill made by American Hunting Rifles, so Wayne Jacobson. I've shot that, and I've also shot a 700 AHR. But I mean, when you shoot that, there's a picture of me. The rifle is vertical on my shoulder in recoil. And that rifle went from horizontal to vertical in recoil.
There's another video that really made the rounds maybe 20 years ago of a bunch of Middle Eastern guys shooting a giant rifle and knocking them down and all of that stuff. Surely you've seen that, right?
Oh, for sure. That was old Saeed from Aggregate Loading, and that's the 5.77 Tyrannorex or Tyrannosaurus Rex or something. Yeah. Like, those are just novelties. I mean, there's no practical application for that. You shoot the guy who knocks him over, the rifle actually hits the glass behind and breaks the glass. That's the one.
Yeah, maybe so. There was a couple of them I've seen, and it was several different guys shooting all of that stuff. And I mean, it seemed like these guys someone was playing a trick on these guys and giving them this rifle to shoot, and they had no idea what it was going to do, and that sort of thing. That's not a nice trick to do to a guy. In any case, as we wrap up, can you hit the highlights of the legal considerations hunters need to keep in mind when it comes to plains and dangerous game hunting in Africa, so everyone can stay on the right side of the law first and foremost?
Okay, this is Zimbabwe now, so obviously it differs for every country, but this is for Zimbabwe. So for dangerous game, the legal caliber is 9.2 millimeters, which is very strange because there's not many 9.2 calibers, and 5,300 kilojoules, which is probably just over 3,500 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Then they have a category for very large dangerous game. So that's giraffe and eland, and lion is included in that. And the 7 millimeter is the legal minimum caliber, and it has to produce 3,170 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. So 7 millimeter Remington Magnum is probably the lowest starting point for that. Then they have large plains game and leopard. So there's also 7 millimeter is the minimum caliber, but 2,212 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. So that's the realm of the 7 millimeter Maus or 7x57. And then for small and medium-sized plains game, the minimum was 6 millimeter. So you're in the realm of the 243 and things like that. So that gives you the basic starting point.
You know, like you said, that was Zimbabwe. Other countries are going to be similar. I know Namibia, instead of 5,300 joules, it's 5,400. But still, I mean, it's not that big of a deal. Even if it's not a legal requirement for where you're planning on hunting, if you're following those rules, you're probably going to be set up for success with that stuff. Now, what would you say are what is your guess would be the 3 to 5 most popular cartridges that are used by clients, and if they're different, by professional hunters for that you've seen hunting plains game and dangerous game in Africa?
Well, plains game, I still think that probably the most logical choice and probably the most popular thing is the 3006. I mean, you're going to find 3006 ammunition in virtually every safari camp, certainly in South Africa and certainly in Namibia. And then 300 Win Mag. You know, the Namibians really like 300 Win Mag. But 3006 300 Mag is probably the most popular plains game. It will cover everything up to the eland. And then for the dangerous game, well, obviously the 375 Holland and Holland. And then probably the fourth would be the 458 Win, 458 lot. I mean, every safari camp is going to have 375 H&H and 458 Win lot. 458 not Win lot, sorry, 458 lot. And then you probably find a smattering of 416s as well. Probably the Remington probably a bit more popular than the Rigby because Remington ammunition is quite a bit cheaper than 416 Rigby ammunition. So my choice would be 38, 300 Win Mag, 375 H&H, 458 lots, and then probably 416 Remington. Those would be my logical conclusion. And as we discussed, the reason why that's so is because they all just work.
Now, is there any divergence between what you're seeing, the most popular stuff that clients are bringing over versus what the PHs are using for their rifles and for the client rifles?
I've been out of it for quite a few years now, John. So, I did my last hunt, buffalo hunt, with the PH in 2002, so 20 years ago. So maybe things have changed. Maybe more guys are bringing out 416 Ruger now. Maybe I'm not 100% sure, and maybe I just watched a video just yesterday of a guy hunting in the tree with a 6.5 C. So it was just hot press and off the block, So, and those cartridges certainly went around when I was guiding.
Well, the 6.5 PRC is only about 3 or 4 years old, so yeah, it's a pretty darn new cartridge. Everything that you said there was pretty well in line with what I would have expected. That is interesting what you said about the 300 Win Mag. I really like that cartridge myself. I've done a lot of hunting with it here. I did not expect it to be so popular in Africa, but learn interesting the things you learn.
Well, that was in Namibia because Namibia, it's quite open and long, and certainly up in the Damara land there were guys that were culling those Hartman's mountain zebra. Those shots were at least 250 meter shots, and all their cartridge was either the 300 Win Mag or the 338 Win Mag. Those are big, heavy animals. Those mountain zebra are probably larger and more stocky than the plains, the ordinary plains zebra.
Yeah, my dad shot one when we went on our hunt over there, and I shot a regular plain zebra a couple years later in Zimbabwe, and it was, it might as well have been two different animals. It basically is.
They will crossbreed, but one's quite a bit bigger than the other.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, very interesting as always, Kevin. As we wrap up, is there, any last things you want to share with the audience?
No, I think just about covered everything, John.
Okay, well, it is a pleasure having you on the show as always. Thanks a lot for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure, John. I hope your clientele will find it interesting.
Now, like we discussed at the start of this episode, hunting Africa is very different from hunting in North America. For instance, a person who pulls a hard-to-get elk tag might only get one shot at a good bull elk over the course of a week-long hunt in many places in North America. I'm not saying that is a reason to do something foolish, but that might mean you should be prepared to take a 350 or a 400-yard shot. And with the right equipment and with enough practice, that is challenging but definitely doable for many hunters. On the other hand, if you're in Africa and you can't get any closer than 400 yards to an animal that you're after, there's a good chance that your professional hunter will recommend that you do not shoot and then just try again for a closer shot on a different animal later on in the hunt, whether that is later that day or in the next couple of days. Game numbers in general are higher in a lot of parts of Africa compared to the USA, and at the same time, you probably don't have to worry about there being a bunch of other hunters in that area you'll need to deal with either in Africa. That is, of course, in stark contrast to a public land hunt for deer, elk, whatever in North America. So in a situation like that in Africa, there's probably less need to press a marginal situation. Now that, combined with the fact that the brush is also thicker in a lot of Africa, with a few exceptions, means that most hunters shoot game inside 200 meters. And of course, the fact that a lot of plains game over there, like Gemsbok, wildebeest, zebra, kudu, and eland, are closer in size to elk than they are to deer, means that larger caliber cartridges shooting heavier bullets at a moderate velocity are quite popular. That's even more true when hunting really big game like Cape buffalo. Now, like Kevin said over and over, that sweet spot for hunting thick-skinned, dangerous game seems to be a cartridge shooting a bullet with a high sectional density around 0.32 or ideally above 0.338 at about 2150 feet per second or thereabouts. With a .416 caliber cartridge that is about a 400 grain bullet, and with a .45 caliber cartridge that is about a 500 grain bullet. Now you have a little bit of leeway with plains game, but we're still looking for cartridges shooting high sectional density bullets above 300, ideally higher, at a moderate velocity of say 25, 26, 2700 feet per second. That's not a hard and fast rule, but it is interesting to see how the most popular and most effective cartridges seem to check all of those boxes. And like we said, a given weight and caliber bullet at a given velocity will perform the same regardless of what it is shot from. The numbers are the numbers, and it doesn't matter exactly how you get there as long as you do. You can do that with a .458 lot. You can do it with a .458 Win Mag. You can do it with a .416 Rigby. Doesn't matter. When everything comes together right, you'll have a cartridge with enough velocity for good bullet expansion and enough, but not too much, remember that story he told at the beginning of the show, penetration at typical shooting ranges on the game you're hunting that at the same time won't have terrible recoil and or terrible muzzle blast. With all those things in mind, it should not be surprising why guys like him don't like really high velocity cartridges. Since shooting ranges aren't too long, the flatter trajectory isn't that important with those cartridges, but that extra velocity comes at the cost of additional recoil, additional muzzle blast, and or erratic terminal performance. There's a time and a place for the higher velocity cartridges, but they are usually not necessary in Africa, especially on dangerous game like buffalo. Now, in that vein, the 300 Win Mag seems to be towards the upper limit velocity-wise of what's really popular and effective over there. With a 180 grain bullet, you're going to get a muzzle velocity of around 2,900 feet per second with a lot of factory loads. And that is flat shooting enough for the more open areas of Africa, like the Kalahari. But in most cases, you're still going to get great terminal performance without excessive recoil and muzzle blast. And once again, that's assuming that you're using a good quality bullet, etc. And also, like we also talked about, pay close attention to your rifle weight. In contrast to, say, sheep hunting, where you're trying to shave ounces off of a rifle to make it as easy to carry as is possible in really, really tough terrain, sometimes the opposite is better in Africa, especially if you're using a real heavy-hitting cartridge. Additional weight makes the rifle a little bit harder to carry, but it can help tame recoil. And a rifle that is too light for a particular load is not fun to shoot, and then that often translates into poor shot placement. Now, the good news about Africa, for the most part, like I said, there's always exceptions, but for the most part, you're going to be hunting terrain that is more or less flat. You'll get rolling hills sometimes, but it's not like you're literally climbing mountains for the most part over there like you would be hunting mountain goat or sheep or something like that in North America. So rifle weight, you want it to be light enough that it is not terrible to carry, but be careful with those rifles that are too light. But even so, there are some cartridges, like we talked about, that are just so darn powerful that even a really, really heavy rifle is still just brutal to shoot. So in that vein, I've put links to the two videos Kevin and I talked about in the show notes, with the guy shooting the 700 Nitro and then those Middle Eastern gentlemen shooting the 5.77 T-Rex. Let's just say that the guy shooting the 700 Nitro handled the recoil a lot better than the guy shooting the 5.77. But take a look at those videos. You'll get a good laugh out of them. As we wrap up, please do me a big favor and hit that subscribe or follow button in whatever podcast app you're using if you enjoyed this episode. Additionally, please leave a rating and a review for the show as well. Doing both of those things helps me reach other hunters like you who enjoy this sort of content, and you'll also start to receive my new episodes automatically every Thursday when I release them. Next, visit thebiggamehuntingblog.com/Kevin and pick up a copy of Kevin's books. In that vein, Kevin has joined me for well over a dozen episodes of the Big Game Hunting Podcast, talking about all sorts of topics: buffalo hunting, elephant conservation, lion and leopard hunting, bullets and rifles for hunting Africa, etc. If you liked this episode, I'm sure you will enjoy those other interviews as well. To make things easier for you, I have included links to all of my other interviews with him in the show notes. Check out that list to make sure you listen to them all. There are some real gems in there with some fascinating and very entertaining stories and a lot of hard-earned knowledge. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.